Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our second Initiative at Home event. And thank you very much for coming along tonight. We could have a discussion later if you like. Initiative at Home is where we are going to talk about what we are doing, what we are interested in, how we are trying to shape the policy agenda. We as a think tank at the New Zealand Initiative, and we are very pleased tonight to have a colleague who's also working in think tank land, although far away in Brussels and London, Shane Frith, Director of the New Direction Foundation. Now I should perhaps explain a little bit how this event came about. Shane and I, we actually worked together, well not physically together, but in think tank land in Westminster. And Westminster is of course a village and you all know each other, even if you're working in different think tanks. And so we actually spent a good time together in London and had a lot of exchange back then and shared a few drinks at one stage over the Eurovision Song Contest, which I still fondly remember. So when I...
The audience, right?
Yeah. So that's to say we had a good time together in London. Yeah. So when I sent an email around to my contacts in London that I got this new job here in Wellington, Shane replied immediately. I think it was within 5 minutes, said, "That's fantastic, congratulations. By the way, we can catch up. I'm going to come back to New Zealand and we should do stuff together." I said, "Yeah, okay, fine. What are we going to do? Are you going to talk about how think tanks work in Britain and in Brussels?" And Shane immediately said yes. So this was basically the idea for tonight's event. What we really want to find out tonight is how think tanks work, how think tanks shape the policy agenda. And I mean, to do it in Brussels and in London is probably as good as it gets in think tank land, apart from perhaps the American think tanks, because there is such a variety of them. There are think tanks on the left, on the right, in the center. There are big ones, small ones, all sorts of weird ones actually. But I'm glad to say that Shane has great experience working in a number of very respectable think tanks. He worked at the Stockholm Network, which is a think tank network. He was the director of Progressive Vision, his own think tank. And he's now working for a think tank that actually works in two places at the same time, in London and Brussels. And that's because he's trying to shape the policy agenda for David Cameron's Conservatives in Europe, which is of course always quite a critical issue. So what we try to do tonight, we try to explore how think tanks actually shape the policy agenda in Britain, in Europe, and how Shane, as a New Zealander, I should have mentioned, experiences working in think tanks in Britain, and what I, as a European working in New Zealand think tanks, can learn from that. So without further ado, over to Shane. Thank you.
Thank you, Oliver. It's a great pleasure to be here, and as you touched upon, it's extremely ironic that before coming here to Wellington for a conference, the last capital I went to for think tank work was Berlin, where we were trying to educate Germans on the state of the Eurozone crisis and trying to suggest a few changes. I think you've got more chance of saving New Zealand than I've got of saving Germany. So
we could always swap, you know.
I wish you well. I don't want to dwell too much on the Eurozone crisis, but it's a major challenge. And one thing that we did have at the conference I've attended, we've been talking about the success of the Asia-Pacific region. And I wanted to ask at one point one of the presenters as to how on earth has Asia-Pacific managed to achieve the prosperity and the growth that they've achieved without a common currency. It must be so hard to export to China, having to actually change currencies. But that's something that too many people in Europe don't seem to understand, and has led to the current crisis. As Oliver said, I've been working in think tanks for 8 years, basically since I left New Zealand 8 years ago. And I partly left because I wanted to work... Sorry?
Deportation.
I was deported, yes. My association with David Farrar had me chased out of the country by Helen Clark. So I left, and it was because I had been heavily involved in politics here. I was the chairman of the Young Nationals. I was a candidate for the National Party on 2 occasions, and the problem I found with politics is that it's far too much about having to say what is palatable to the public, not what is actually needed. And I realised that if I was to remain in politics, I was going to have to compromise too much, and I decided I wanted to go off and work in think tanks. And that is not to say, of course, that I'm going to demean the role of the elected officials that are around the room here tonight, because I do know that both are needed, and I think that think tanks are complementary to the politicians. And I think one of the key things is that think tanks sadly now need to be helping to clear the way to allow politicians to do the right thing. And you know, I should point out, you know, we're actually very lucky here tonight, and that we've actually got probably the most influential person in New Zealand politics in the room right now, and that's John Keyes-Polster. if David here came up with an opinion poll that said actually we realise that national superannuation is unaffordable and the age does need to be extended to match with the ageing population, I'm sure very quickly that problem would be addressed. But that is, you know, I can be critical of that, but I also recognise the political realities of, you know, you can't pursue an agenda of political suicide. But it is therefore the role of think tanks to try and communicate that message. And I think that is, it's a twofold thing. It's part of the modern media. It is, well, I must say, it's improved a lot since the internet occurred and has diversified, and less people are listening to Morning Report and other selected sort of sources, and there's more choice out there. But that's part of it. But the more sophistication of polling, and then of course proportional representation, has meant that politics has become very much about what is politically achievable rather than, you know, what is the right agenda. And on top of that, the desire of a lot of politicians to actually go out there and try and shift the debate. That's something you seldom see either here, from the limited amount I follow of New Zealand politics anymore, and certainly in Britain there's not a lot of politicians who say, well look, we can't do X right now, but we've got to start thinking about these things, and we may need to move in this direction in the future to try and educate the public and to start to prepare the ground to shift. And think tanks have been instrumental in doing that abroad. And it's occurred most significantly in the United States, and then again in the United Kingdom. The US is, without a doubt, as Oliver touched upon, has got the largest concentration of think tanks. And if you go to Washington DC, there's an amazing range across the spectrum. And it's a vibrant debate. And I think for many of us, it's probably the first time that we got introduced to think tanks, because, you know, when we got CNN sort of coming in on Sky TV back in the 90s, and you'd suddenly see these people popping up from a think tank, and at that point in time I had no idea what a think tank did. But they were articulating messages that here were only being debated by politicians or journalists or occasionally university academics and so forth. And a lot of the reforms that were implemented by the Reagan administration in the 80s started off from the think tank world that had been carried out in the 60s and the 70s before that. And that certainly occurred in Britain when Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister in 1979. A lot of the economic reforms that she pushed through had been trialled and promoted and discussed by think tanks such as the Adam Smith Institute, the Institute for Economic Affairs, that achieved two things. One, it gave the ministers and the government a blueprint of what needed to be done that was separate from what the bureaucracy thought needed to be done. And you know, we've all had experiences working with politicians where the advice that they're getting from their officials run quite contrary to well, you know, common sense on many of occasions. And so think tanks do provide that ability to provide a counter-argument and to shift that. And so that was certainly very, very true. It was the founder of the Heritage Foundation in Washington DC once said that think tanks are effectively political parties that never seek election. And I think that's quite true, and I think that's very much how they operate. And I do believe that the best think tanks are genuinely non-aligned think tanks, and I'm delighted that the New Zealand Initiative is in that category. I work for one that is explicitly aligned with the Conservative Party. My board is made up of British Conservative and other centre-right politicians from the European Parliament, and it affects what we can say and do. And so we're not as independent as we would like to be, but we do our bit to shift the debate. Whereas a think tank such as the New Zealand Initiative does give that ability to float ideas based on objective research of what is required without there being political repercussions for a political party. So I think that's definitely the way to go. And it's those think tanks that have been independent that have been most successful in Britain. The other example I would touch upon is think tanks have been important in the current Conservative Liberal Democrat government in Britain. A number of the key policies, and certainly from my point of view, some of the best policies that have been implemented were first advocated through the think tank community in the years leading up to the Conservative government. And one you will be well, in fact actually both will be relevant here in New Zealand. One is the issue of school choice, and I think we're calling it charter schools here. And these are issues that were discussed at length by think tanks and debated and thrashed out a lot well before the election in 2010. And that's now a key part of the Conservative Liberal Democrat government, where there are charter schools popping up all over Britain. And the second area, and these were advocated primarily. Correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think Policy Exchange did, but certainly Policy Exchange did. The think tank I worked at for a while called Reform advocated it, and certainly the Institute for Economic Affairs and Adam Smith. There's a lot of think tanks who were advocating it in the past. Then the second area would be on welfare reform, and certainly something we saw in the 90s and I suspect is in need of again. But in Britain, the current Pension Secretary, Ian Duncan Smith, when he was in opposition, set up a think tank, and despite it was founded by a British Conservative, in fact the former leader of the party, it was seen to be non-partisan. It worked with people across the spectrum, and it has done a lot of work on looking at welfare reform. And it's done it from an objective point of view. It's done it from from a very valid point of view about what welfare is doing to the welfare recipient. It wasn't doing it from we've got to balance the budget, how do we cut the welfare budget? It said, what is welfare doing to these people who are trapped? And there are a lot of people in Britain who have been trapped into the welfare system and don't get out. And they did a lot of work on this, a lot of welfare into work type experiments, type policies, and they're now experimenting with different issues, including some things that were trialled here in the 90s in New Zealand, the sort of the work for the dole type regimes and others that are designed to just try and prod people into moving on from where they were. So these are ideas that were advocated by think tanks, lobbied in a way to the politicians, and then have now been implemented. And I think, and certainly it's those ideas that are best thought out that are actually having quite positive, quite a positive influence within the current government. And it's the areas where policies didn't have think tanks and groups doing a lot of work on it before the current government set up that they're running into trouble. There's been some so-called reforms on health policy, but nothing that any think tank I was aware of was advocating before the government took over. It's been designed by bureaucrats and some politicians without a lot of research into what's required. And my view, what's going to happen on the health policy is the reforms, while broadly okay, are better than the status quo. They will get all the blame for everything that's wrong with the current system, and eventually, they'll be all turned out. And I personally believe that's what happened in this country in the 90s. The welfare reforms got all the blame for every time someone didn't get the operation on time, but actually the underlying system was at fault. If you don't do the reform well, that's exactly what's going to happen. So I'm fairly unsurprisingly a firm supporter of think tanks. I think it's the sort of thing that needs to change the debate. It's interesting that it can be, as I said, the best are through non-partisan think tanks, because you can create dialogue with both sides. And of course, we all have, and I believe that there's a mixture of views here as well. There is demons thrown up on all sides about what the other side think. Socialists think that those on the right are just heartless capitalists who want to run the poor into the ground, and those of us on the right think that the left are just idiots who can't add up on a calculator. And that's both an exaggeration, and it's important that we engage in some of these issues and try and have an intelligent discussion, and actually, often more importantly, a philosophical discussion. So often politics has become so much about the centre of debate. There's actually not much of a debate about ideas anymore. Personally, I'm a libertarian or a classical liberal, but I'm happy to debate with a socialist about socialist ideas. The problem you get in politics as often is a very fine debate between two people who aren't actually that different, but they're desperately trying to win some votes. And I think that you can still, that think tanks provide that ground for some interesting and intelligent debate. So I applaud what you're trying to do, and certainly if there's anything we can do from afar to help, I'd be delighted, but I'd certainly encourage all of you to do what you can to help out the initiative. But I was asked just to make some starting remarks and hopefully have a discussion rather than me just stand here and talk at you, so I'll conclude at this point.
Thank you.